So we're going to represent this function as a power series, and again we always go back to what we know, which is that if we had u to the n here, that's expressed as a function as 1 over 1 minus u. So we need to express this function to utilize this and determine what our u is. Well, first of all, we have an x times this function because of that x in the numerator, and then I'm going to turn the terms around in the denominator and then write it as a negative because we need to get it in this form of 1 over 1 minus u. So now I can tell what the u is, and I can express this as a power series, and it will be x times that power series, and that's going to be negative 4x to the n. Then I think I am going to move the x in to combine things here, so I'm going to express this just a little bit differently. So we're going to have the sum as n goes from 0 to infinity. We'll have negative 4 to the n, and then we'll have x to the n plus 1, because if we move this x inside, that was x to the n times x to the 1. So here is our power series representation of that function, and now we will go ahead and determine 5 coefficients, and so we'll have our first 5 coefficients here, and that basically is the constant, then the coefficient on the x term, then the x squared term, and so forth. So first let's take this and put in a 0, and if we put in a 0 and a 0, we actually get out an x. So what that tells us is that our first coefficient is actually a 0 because we don't have a constant term here, because when we put in 0 here, we have this is a 1 and then this is x to the 1. So our first coefficient was a 0, and then our c sub 1, which is our coefficient on the x term, is a 1. Now let's continue, and we will put in a 1, and so we would have negative 4 to the 1, and then we would have x to the 1 plus 1, or x squared. So we can see that our coefficient on the squared term is negative 4. And then our next one, we're going to go ahead and put in a 2. So we'd have negative 4 to x to the third. So our coefficient there is going to be a 16, because we see our next term is going to be 16x cubed. And then let's go ahead and put in a 3. And so we have negative 4 to the third, and then x to the 3 plus 1, which is x to the fourth. And so our last coefficient is going to be negative 64. Now let's go ahead and answer this question of determining the radius of convergence. We know that the series converges if the absolute value of u is less than 1. So my u was negative 4x, and so I can not worry about the negative because of the absolute value. And so the absolute value of x needs to be less than 1/4. So my radius of convergence is 1/4.